The story of NATO's nuclear first strike doctrine begins in the uneasy calm that followed the devastation of the Second World War, when Europe emerged physically ruined, politically fractured, and psychologically traumatized, and when the United States and its Western allies confronted a strategic reality that appeared, on paper, profoundly unfavorable. The Soviet Union possessed massive conventional forces stationed across Eastern Europe, while Western Europe remained demilitarized, economically fragile, and deeply fearful of another continental war, leading American and European planners to conclude that they could not defend the continent through conventional means alone. From this imbalance emerged a doctrine that would shape the Cold War for decades, a doctrine rooted in the belief that nuclear weapons were not merely tools of last resort, but the central pillar of Western defense, a belief formalized in the early 1950s as NATO adopted the strategy of massive retaliation, openly signaling that any large-scale Soviet attack, even a conventional one, could trigger an immediate nuclear response. This was not a bluff conceived lightly, but a calculated attempt to compensate for weakness with threat, to deter Soviet aggression by convincing Moscow that war in Europe would escalate instantly into a catastrophe neither side could survive. And for a time, this logic appeared to hold, reinforcing the fragile stability of a divided continent. Yet as the Cold War matured, the simplicity of massive retaliation became its own liability, because it forced NATO leaders into an impossible dilemma: either accept defeat in a conventional war or initiate nuclear annihilation over limited objectives, a rigidity that troubled strategists on both sides of the Atlantic and became increasingly untenable as nuclear arsenals grew and political crises multiplied. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, American defense thinkers began searching for alternatives that would preserve deterrence without locking the alliance into suicidal inflexibility, leading to the development of flexible response, a doctrine formally adopted by NATO in 1967, which envisioned a graduated escalation from conventional defense to tactical nuclear use, and, only as a final step, to strategic nuclear exchange. On paper, flexible response appeared more humane and controllable, but in practice it embedded nuclear weapons even deeper into NATO's war planning, particularly on European soil, where short-range nuclear weapons were deployed in staggering numbers, intended for use against advancing Soviet forces in Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, transforming the continent itself into the primary battlefield of a nuclear war that NATO planners hoped would remain limited, but privately understood could spiral out of control within hours. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, this uneasy balance persisted, sustained by mutual fear, arms control agreements, and a tacit understanding that nuclear war was unwinnable. Yet beneath this surface stability, military planning grew increasingly complex and aggressive, as both sides sought not merely to deter, but to prevail if deterrence failed. In the United States, advances in accuracy, command and control systems, and intelligence fueled a growing belief among some strategists that nuclear war might be survivable, even controllable, if fought decisively and preemptively, a belief that gained momentum in the late 1970s and early 1980s as relations between East and West sharply deteriorated. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the collapse of détente, and the election of governments in Washington and London that viewed the Cold War in stark moral terms contributed to a renewed emphasis on strength, resolve, and military credibility, particularly in Europe, where NATO leaders worried that decades of peace had dulled the alliance's readiness and emboldened Moscow. It was in this context that a new generation of operational doctrines emerged, doctrines that blurred the line between deterrence and warfighting, most notably the American-developed concept of AirLand Battle, which envisioned deep, coordinated strikes against Soviet forces far behind the front lines, targeting command centers, logistics hubs, and reinforcements before they could be brought to bear. While AirLand Battle was officially framed as a conventional doctrine, its implications were unmistakably nuclear, because executing such deep strikes in the face of overwhelming Warsaw Pact numbers would almost certainly require early nuclear use, a reality well understood by Soviet planners who interpreted the doctrine as evidence that NATO was preparing for a disarming first strike rather than a purely defensive response. Simultaneously, NATO embarked on one of the most controversial military deployments of the Cold War, the stationing of new intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Western Europe, including the Pershing II ballistic missile and ground-launched cruise missiles, weapons whose speed, accuracy, and forward positioning dramatically reduced warning times for Soviet leadership and intensified fears that NATO could decapitate the Soviet command structure before it could respond. To Western officials, these deployments were presented as a necessary counter to Soviet SS-20 missiles and as leverage in arms control negotiations. But to Moscow, they appeared as a fundamental shift in the balance of terror, a move that suggested not deterrence, but preparation, not defense, but the capacity for a sudden, paralyzing strike. Across Europe, these developments triggered massive public opposition as millions of citizens took to the streets in protest, convinced that their countries were being transformed into nuclear tripwires for a superpower confrontation they neither controlled nor fully understood, while governments insisted that strength and unity were the only paths to peace. Behind closed doors, NATO war planners refined scenarios that assumed rapid escalation under conditions of confusion, misinterpretation, and degraded communications, rehearsing the transition from conventional defense to nuclear release in exercises that compressed decision-making timelines to minutes and assumed near-perfect coordination under unimaginable stress. The paradox at the heart of NATO's first strike-capable posture was that while it was designed to prevent war, it relied on demonstrating a willingness to initiate nuclear use early and decisively, a posture that demanded constant signaling, readiness, and credibility, and that inevitably appeared threatening to an adversary, conditioned by its own history of invasion and devastation. By the early 1980s, as new weapon systems came online and military exercises grew larger and more realistic, the gap between NATO's self-perception as a defensive alliance and Soviet perceptions of encirclement and impending attack widened dangerously, creating a climate in which miscalculation became not merely possible but likely, setting the stage for a series of near-catastrophic confrontations in which doctrine, technology, and human fear collided, and in which the abstract logic of nuclear strategy would be tested against the unpredictable realities of political crisis and imperfect information, revealing just how thin the line between deterrence and disaster had become at the height of the Cold War. As NATO's nuclear posture hardened in the early 1980s, the alliance entered a period of unprecedented operational intensity, marked by exercises, deployments, and doctrinal refinements that transformed theoretical war plans into rehearsed realities. And nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the scale and realism of NATO training maneuvers, which increasingly simulated the very escalation pathways that planners feared might one day be triggered for real. Large multinational exercises practiced rapid mobilization, forward movement of reinforcements, and the integration of conventional and nuclear forces under compressed timelines, while command posts drilled the procedures for requesting and authorizing nuclear release, often under assumptions of disrupted communications, ambiguous intelligence, and overwhelming pressure to act before the initiative was lost. These exercises were intended to strengthen deterrence by demonstrating readiness and cohesion, yet they also sent powerful signals to the Soviet Union, which monitored them closely through intelligence collection and interpreted their realism as evidence that NATO was preparing not merely to respond to aggression, but to seize the initiative in a crisis. This perception was amplified by technological changes that altered the strategic balance in subtle but profound ways, particularly the deployment of the Pershing II missile, whose accuracy and short flight time drastically reduced warning intervals for Soviet leadership, creating the fear that a NATO strike could eliminate command centers before retaliation could be ordered, a fear that struck at the heart of Soviet nuclear doctrine, which depended on the ability to respond decisively to any attack. In Moscow, these developments were analyzed through the lens of history and ideology, shaped by memories of surprise invasion and by a worldview that assumed Western hostility as a constant, leading Soviet intelligence agencies to interpret NATO's actions not as defensive measures, but as preparatory steps toward a first strike, an interpretation that gained traction as rhetoric on both sides grew sharper and more absolutist. Within the Kremlin, aging leadership struggled to interpret a rapidly changing strategic environment, relying heavily on intelligence assessments that emphasized worst-case scenarios and discounted Western assurances, a dynamic that reinforced a cycle of mutual suspicion in which each side's attempts to enhance security were perceived by the other as aggressive escalation. NATO's internal debates reflected a similar tension, as civilian leaders sought to balance deterrence with political legitimacy in the face of massive public opposition, while military planners insisted that credibility required visible readiness and the willingness to act decisively if deterrence failed. The result was a posture that rested on constant signaling, continuous modernization, and the acceptance of extraordinary risk, justified by the belief that any relaxation of resolve would invite Soviet pressure or miscalculation. This belief shaped the alliance's approach to crisis management, emphasizing rapid decision-making and forward deployment, even as analysts warned that such measures reduce the margin for error and increase the likelihood that routine activities could be misread as preparations for war. The danger lay not in deliberate aggression, but in the interaction of doctrine, technology, and human psychology, as compressed timelines left little room for verification or diplomacy, and as both sides trained themselves to expect escalation under conditions of uncertainty. In this environment, intelligence assessments took on heightened importance, yet they were themselves subject to bias, shaped by institutional incentives that rewarded vigilance over restraint and treated ambiguous signals as confirmation of hostile intent. Soviet intelligence reporting during this period increasingly emphasized indicators of imminent attack, while NATO analysts interpreted Soviet alerts and exercises as evidence of aggressive planning, creating a feedback loop in which each side's fears validated the other's preparations. Arms control efforts, which might have provided a stabilizing counterweight, struggled to gain traction amid this climate of mistrust, as negotiations over intermediate-range nuclear forces became entangled with alliance politics and domestic opposition, delaying agreements that could have reduced tensions and warning times. Meanwhile, the public debate in Europe grew more polarized as peace movements challenged the legitimacy of nuclear deployment and questioned whether deterrence truly served democratic interests, while governments argued that unilateral restraint would undermine alliance unity and expose Europe to coercion. Beneath these debates lay a deeper anxiety about control, as citizens recognized that decisions with existential consequences were being rehearsed in secret governed by doctrines and procedures largely invisible to the public, and increasingly driven by technological imperatives rather than political judgment. By rehearsing the mechanics of nuclear escalation in ever greater detail, NATO sought to prevent war through preparedness. Yet this very preparedness narrowed the space for de-escalation and magnified the consequences of error, creating a strategic environment in which peace depended not only on rational calculation, but on flawless execution and perfect interpretation, conditions rarely met in human affairs. The early 1980s thus represented a critical inflection point in the Cold War, when the accumulation of doctrinal ambition, technological capability, and political rigidity pushed the alliance closer to the edge than many contemporaries realized, setting the stage for moments in which exercises would be mistaken for attacks. Warnings would blur into alarms, and the logic of deterrence would be tested by the limits of perception and trust, revealing just how precarious the nuclear peace had become. By the mid-1980s, the implications of NATO's evolving nuclear posture were no longer confined to abstract strategy papers or closed-door planning sessions, but were increasingly felt as a pervasive sense of unease that permeated political leadership on both sides of the Iron Curtain, as the combination of first-strike-capable systems, aggressive doctrines, and relentless exercises created a strategic atmosphere in which the distinction between preparation and provocation became dangerously blurred. Within the Soviet Union, this atmosphere was interpreted through an intelligence framework that had grown steadily more alarmist, particularly as Western rhetoric emphasized resolve and moral clarity, while new weapon systems compressed decision-making timelines to unprecedented levels, reinforcing the belief that a surprise attack could come with little or no warning. Soviet military planners, deeply influenced by the trauma of past invasions and by the technical realities of nuclear command and control, increasingly focused on the vulnerability of their leadership and communications infrastructure, concluding that NATO's deployments in Europe, especially the Pershing II missiles, posed an existential threat that could not be dismissed as merely defensive. This fear fed into a broader reassessment of Soviet readiness, leading to heightened alert levels, expanded intelligence collection, and a renewed emphasis on rapid response, all of which further intensified the cycle of mutual suspicion. NATO, for its part, interpreted Soviet alerts and doctrinal writings as confirmation that Moscow was preparing for aggressive action, reinforcing the alliance's conviction that deterrence required constant demonstration of capability and will. This mutual reinforcement of fear created a strategic environment in which both sides believed they were reacting defensively, even as their actions appeared increasingly offensive to the other, a classic security dilemma magnified by nuclear weapons and ideological hostility. The practical consequence of this dynamic was a steady erosion of the margin for error, as both alliances trained themselves to expect escalation and to respond quickly under conditions of ambiguity, reducing opportunities for verification, communication, or political intervention once a crisis began. Within NATO command structures, war games and exercises simulated scenarios in which nuclear use occurred early, often within days or even hours of conflict onset, reflecting the belief that delay would favor the numerically superior Warsaw Pact, and that hesitation could prove fatal. These assumptions were mirrored on the Soviet side, where planners prepared for rapid transition from conventional defense to nuclear response, driven by the fear that waiting could leave them decapitated and unable to retaliate. The result was a form of mutual hostage-taking, in which both sides accepted the risk of catastrophic escalation as the price of avoiding defeat, even as they publicly insisted that their doctrines were purely defensive. This contradiction became increasingly visible to political leaders, particularly in Europe, where governments faced growing domestic opposition to nuclear deployments and mounting anxiety about the prospect of their territories becoming the primary battleground of a superpower war. Protests against Euro missiles and nuclear exercises reflected not only fear of annihilation, but also a deeper skepticism about the rationality of doctrines that assumed controlled escalation in an environment defined by uncertainty and human fallibility. Yet despite these pressures, alliance cohesion held, sustained by the belief that unity itself was a form of deterrence, and that any sign of weakness could invite Soviet coercion or miscalculation. Behind the scenes, however, even senior officials acknowledged the fragility of the situation, as internal assessments warned that misinterpretation of exercises, intelligence errors, or technical failures could trigger irreversible escalation, a recognition that underscored the extent to which peace depended on restraint, luck, and the absence of crisis rather than on any inherent stability in the system. As new generations of weapons and doctrines were integrated into NATO planning, the alliance found itself committed to a posture that required constant vigilance and perpetual readiness, leaving little room for relaxation or experimentation with alternative approaches. The cumulative effect of these choices was to lock both sides into a strategic stalemate, characterized by high tension and low trust, in which the possibility of nuclear war was simultaneously unthinkable and rehearsed in detail. This paradox reached its most dangerous expression during moments when routine military activity intersected with heightened political tension, creating conditions in which worst-case assumptions dominated decision-making, and where the difference between deterrence and disaster hinged on subjective interpretation. It was within this precarious environment that the Cold War came closest to catastrophe, without the public ever realizing it, as doctrines designed to prevent war instead created pathways by which it could be triggered unintentionally, exposing the profound risks inherent in strategies that relied on early nuclear use as a guarantor of peace. The experience of this period would later prompt a reassessment of nuclear doctrine and contribute to renewed arms control efforts. But at the time, it remained largely hidden from view, shielded by secrecy and the belief that exposing the true extent of the danger would undermine deterrence itself, leaving societies to live unknowingly on the edge of annihilation as a consequence of decisions made in the name of security. The strain created by NATO's nuclear posture and the Soviet response to it culminated in a series of incidents and revelations that, taken together, exposed how close doctrine and reality had drifted toward catastrophe, as the early 1980s demonstrated that the greatest danger no longer lay in deliberate aggression, but in misinterpretation, automation, and the human tendency to expect the worst when systems were designed around worst-case assumptions. Intelligence warnings multiplied, military alerts became more frequent, and both alliances developed habits of thinking that treated ambiguity as threat, a mindset reinforced by technological systems that produced streams of data requiring rapid judgment under pressure. Within NATO, analysts increasingly acknowledged that first-strike-capable deployments and compressed timelines created incentives for preemption on both sides, even as official statements continued to emphasize deterrence and defense, revealing a growing gap between public reassurance and private concern. This gap was mirrored in the Soviet Union, where intelligence services, operating under directives that emphasized vigilance against surprise attack, reported indicators of Western preparation with increasing urgency, often interpreting routine NATO activities through a lens shaped by decades of hostility and reinforced by the visible reality of new missiles positioned close to Soviet borders. The convergence of these perceptions produced a feedback loop in which each side's efforts to signal readiness were read as preparation for war, tightening the spiral of fear and reducing tolerance for uncertainty. European leaders found themselves caught between alliance obligations and public anxiety, aware that their countries hosted weapons that made them prime targets while having limited influence over the doctrines governing their use, a reality that strained democratic accountability and fueled skepticism toward strategic decisions made far beyond national parliaments. Internally, NATO debates increasingly reflected unease about escalation control, as studies questioned whether nuclear war could ever remain limited once initiated, particularly in the densely populated and politically fragmented landscape of Europe, where battlefield use would almost certainly provoke rapid retaliation and uncontrolled escalation. Despite these doubts, the alliance continued to rehearse scenarios that assumed early nuclear release, driven by the belief that abandoning such plans would undermine deterrence and invite Soviet exploitation. The logic was circular and deeply unsettling, as credibility depended on readiness. Readiness required rehearsal, and rehearsal increased the risk of misinterpretation, a dynamic that left little room for error or diplomacy once tensions rose. This reality became starkly evident during periods of heightened alert, when routine exercises overlapped with geopolitical crises and intelligence warnings, creating conditions in which the assumptions embedded in doctrine threatened to override political judgment. In such moments, the abstract language of strategy translated into concrete pressures on individuals tasked with making rapid decisions under uncertainty, exposing the human dimension of nuclear doctrine and the extent to which global survival could hinge on interpretation, restraint, and chance. The awareness of this fragility slowly penetrated political consciousness, contributing to a reevaluation of nuclear policy that would gain momentum later in the decade, as leaders on both sides recognized that the existing balance was not only dangerous but unsustainable. Within NATO, this recognition did not immediately dismantle first-strike-capable systems, but it did encourage renewed interest in arms control and confidence-building measures designed to reduce misperception and increase transparency, efforts that faced resistance from those who feared any concession would weaken deterrence. Nonetheless, the accumulation of near misses and the persistent anxiety of living under compressed timelines eroded confidence in doctrines that relied on early nuclear use, planting the seeds for later agreements that would remove entire classes of weapons from Europe. These developments underscored a central truth of the Cold War, that the most perilous moments often unfolded not during open crises, but within the routines of preparedness, where exercises, alerts, and intelligence assessments intersected in ways that magnified fear and narrowed choices. The legacy of NATO's nuclear first strike doctrine thus lies not only in the weapons deployed or the plans written, but in the strategic culture it fostered, a culture that normalized extreme risk as the price of peace and accepted the possibility of catastrophe as a manageable variable. As the Cold War drew toward its end, this culture would come under increasing scrutiny, challenged by leaders willing to question long-held assumptions and by publics unwilling to accept perpetual existential threat as the foundation of security. Yet during the years when these doctrines dominated planning, the margin between deterrence and disaster remained perilously thin, sustained less by design than by the absence of crisis and the restraint of individuals operating within systems built for war. The story of this period reveals how easily strategic logic can drift toward self-defeating extremes, and how doctrines intended to prevent catastrophe can, under certain conditions, bring it terrifyingly close, leaving behind a sobering lesson about the limits of control in a nuclear age. As awareness of these dangers slowly grew within political and military leadership, the late Cold War witnessed a gradual but consequential shift in how NATO's nuclear posture was understood, debated, and ultimately constrained, as the accumulation of doctrinal risk, public opposition, and near-catastrophic misinterpretations forced a reckoning with strategies that had come to rely on the threat of early nuclear use as their central pillar. This reckoning did not emerge from a single revelation, but from the convergence of multiple pressures, including the recognition that technological sophistication had outpaced human decision-making capacity, that compressed timelines left no room for correction once escalation began, and that the credibility of deterrence itself was being undermined by the growing belief that nuclear war could not, in practice, be controlled or limited. Within NATO, internal reviews increasingly acknowledged that while first-strike-capable systems might strengthen deterrence on paper, they also increased instability by incentivizing preemption and magnifying the consequences of error, a paradox that struck at the heart of alliance strategy. European governments, responding to sustained public protest and political fragmentation, pressed for greater emphasis on arms control and confidence-building measures, seeking to reclaim some measure of agency over decisions that had profound implications for national survival, yet remained largely governed by alliance doctrine and superpower rivalry. This pressure coincided with changes in Soviet leadership and outlook, as reform-minded figures began to challenge the assumptions of perpetual confrontation, opening space for dialogue that had been closed during the most rigid years of Cold War thinking. The result was a tentative but meaningful thaw, expressed through negotiations that aimed not merely to cap arsenals, but to reduce the most destabilizing weapon systems, particularly those deployed in Europe, with short warning, times and high first-strike potential. The Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987 marked a decisive break with the logic that had driven NATO's Euro missile deployments, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons and acknowledging implicitly that their presence had increased rather than reduced the risk of war. This agreement did not dismantle NATO's nuclear posture entirely, nor did it erase decades of doctrine built around early use, but it signaled a recognition that security could not be sustained indefinitely through ever greater readiness for catastrophe. For many observers, the treaty represented a belated admission that the balance of terror had rested as much on luck and restraint as on rational planning, and that the margin for error had been dangerously thin. In retrospect, the persistence of peace during the height of NATO's first-strike-capable era appears less as proof of doctrinal success, and more as a testament to the absence of crisis and the discipline of individuals operating within deeply flawed systems. This reinterpretation challenges the triumphalist narratives that portray Cold War deterrence as a stable equilibrium, instead revealing a fragile construct sustained by fear, secrecy, and the willingness to accept extraordinary risk. The legacy of NATO's nuclear doctrine thus lies not only in the weapons dismantled or treaties signed, but in the enduring questions it raises about how democracies confront existential threat, how much secrecy and risk they are willing to tolerate, and whether security strategies built on the promise of catastrophic retaliation can ever be reconciled with democratic accountability and human fallibility. As the Cold War receded into history, these questions did not disappear, but were carried forward into new debates over deterrence, escalation, and technological control, ensuring that the lessons of this period would remain relevant long after the missiles themselves were gone. In this sense, the story of NATO's nuclear first-strike doctrine is not simply a chapter in military history, but a cautionary tale about the limits of strategic control, the dangers of doctrinal inertia, and the enduring tension between the pursuit of security and the preservation of peace in a nuclear age. The final assessment of NATO's nuclear first strike doctrine emerges only when the Cold War is viewed not as a series of dramatic crises, but as a prolonged condition of managed fear, in which entire societies lived under strategies that assumed catastrophe as an acceptable risk, and where peace was preserved less by design than by the absence of triggering events and the restraint of individuals operating within systems built for war. In retrospect, the alliance's reliance on early nuclear use reflected a profound strategic dilemma rooted in post-war weakness and sustained by decades of institutional momentum, a dilemma that hardened into doctrine even as its underlying assumptions became increasingly questionable. NATO planners had sought to deter aggression by demonstrating resolve and capability, yet in doing so, they constructed a posture that narrowed political choice, compressed decision-making, and magnified the consequences of error, effectively substituting credibility for control and accepting instability as the price of deterrence. The European continent, which these doctrines were meant to defend, became both the linchpin and the potential sacrifice, hosting weapons whose use would have rendered the very concept of defense meaningless, a reality that fueled public resistance and exposed the disconnect between strategic abstraction and lived consequence. The gradual dismantling of first-strike-capable systems in the late Cold War did not erase the legacy of this period, but it did acknowledge, however implicitly, that the balance of terror had been far more precarious than official narratives had long suggested. What endured was not confidence in the wisdom of nuclear strategy, but a sobering recognition of its limits and of the extent to which survival had depended on caution, miscommunication avoided, and crises that never quite happened. NATO's nuclear doctrine, once presented as a rational and necessary shield, thus stands as a testament to how fear can harden into policy and policy into habit, persisting long after its original justification has faded. The Cold War ended without the catastrophe these doctrines were designed to manage. But that outcome should not obscure the risks that were accepted along the way, nor the lessons embedded in a system that came perilously close to failure without ever being fully tested. In the end, the history of NATO's nuclear first strike posture reveals a central paradox of the nuclear age, that strategies built to prevent war can, under conditions of mistrust and technological acceleration, bring it closer, and that the true safeguard against catastrophe lies not in perfect planning, but in the willingness to question assumptions, reduce risk, and recognize the human limits of control in a world where the consequences of error are irreversible.